We've come now to probably the most public miracle or sign that Jesus performed. It's in John's Gospel chapter 6, verses 1 to 15, and it is about Jesus feeding the 5,000. Let me read to you from chapter 6, verse 1. Sometime after this, Jesus crossed to the far shore of the Sea of Galilee, that is, the Sea of Tiberias. And the great crowd of people followed him because they saw the miraculous signs which he'd performed on the sick. Then Jesus went up on the hillside, and he sat down with his disciples. The Jewish Passover feast was near. When Jesus looked up and saw a great crowd of people coming towards him, he said to Philip, "Where shall we buy bread for these people to eat?" And he asked this only to test him, for he already had in mind what he was going to do. Philip answered him, 8 months' wages wouldn't buy enough bread for each one to have a bite." Another of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, spoke up. "Here's a boy with 5 small barley loaves and 2 small fish, but how far will they go amongst so many?" Jesus said, "Make the people sit down." And there was plenty of grass in that place, and the men sat down, about 5,000 of them. Jesus then took the loaves, gave thanks, and distributed to those who were seated as much as they wanted. And he did the same with the fish. And when they had all had enough to eat, he said to his disciples, "Gather the pieces which are left over, and let nothing be wasted." So they gathered them, and they filled 12 baskets with the pieces of the 5 barley loaves left over by those who had eaten. And after the people saw the miraculous sign that Jesus did, they began to say, "Surely this is the prophet who is to come into the world." And Jesus, knowing that they intended to come and make him king by force, withdrew again into the hills by himself. Now, this is one of the most remarkable of all of the miracles that Jesus performed. It's clearly something which struck very strongly in the minds of those who were there with him, because it's one of the few miracles or signs which are repeated in all 4 Gospels, right across the board. And in some Gospels it's done twice. There were 2 feedings, one I think of the 4,000, one of the 5,000. So this happened more than once. Therefore it's quite symbolic and very powerfully attested to by the Bible itself and by the 4 Gospels. It starts off by saying "sometime after this," which is one of John's phrases of an indefinite time period. Sometime after this does not mean shortly after it. It doesn't mean a long time. It could be any time you like. But sometime after this, Jesus crossed to the far shore of the Sea of Galilee. That's the Sea of Tiberias. And it says that it's very close to the Passover feast, which, if so, it might even be almost a whole year since the last event that we spoke about, where Jesus was talking about the healing of the pool up in Jerusalem. So this is almost a year of Jesus' ministry has gone by here, and John has not commented upon it. And in many ways he's assuming that the other Gospels fill in the gaps. In other words, he's assuming that his readers here are conversant with the stories of Jesus and are conversant maybe with the other Gospels too. At least what he's doing is he's picking out what he considers those events which are most significant for his readers at the time. And don't forget, his readers here are quite clearly not Jewish people. The readers that he's writing for are Gentiles, people who are outside the Jewish faith. And you can tell that by the fact that it says in verse 4 that he explains the Jewish Passover feast was near, explaining that it was a Jewish ceremony, Jewish element. He wouldn't need to say that if he was writing to Jewish people. Anyway, what you have then is Jesus has left a crowd of people. He's gone across to the far shore of the Sea of Galilee. The idea being that crossed over in a boat, And almost certainly we hear about this elsewhere. Crossing over in the boat leaves all the crowds behind, because the crowds by this time are pressing on him. They see in him someone who is so central to their own thinking, their own spirituality, someone who's so charismatic, who they are so drawn to. They do not want to be out of his presence. Nevertheless, Jesus needs some space and peace, crosses over to the far side, really to get away from the press of the crowd. But the crowd are not happy to leave Jesus, and they will follow him all the way around, and they will walk, or almost run, right around the entire Lake of Galilee, or the Sea of Galilee. That's a long, long way. It would take them many, many hours to get to that point, to come around but nevertheless, they follow him. And that shows the huge magnetic appeal of Christ, the importance which they placed upon his teaching, and probably more than anything else, the signs and the wonders which they wished to see. There's an idea that the great crowd of people followed him because they saw the miraculous signs he had performed on the sick. In many ways, that's a weakness. It's a weakness of human beings that we're entertained by the thought of the miraculous, the unusual, the miracles. Even Herod wanted to see some kind of miracle from Christ, perform a trick for me. And we're all entranced by that kind of thing which is the novelty, the new and the unusual. Far better if we were more entranced by the teaching and by the quality of Christ's words and by the way in which they shed huge light on human nature and the relationship between human beings and God. That would be the preference. And there are people like that, but they are few and far between. Mostly this crowd wanted to see more miracles and maybe even more entertainment. But maybe we're doing them an injustice, because amongst them they were happy to sit and listen to the teaching of Jesus as well. So these people have followed him all the way around the Sea of Galilee. And there's Jesus. He is sitting on a hillside, so he's got a commanding view. And it doesn't take that long after having a rest, after having conversed with his disciples, that he can see from the commanding view this huge crowd coming around the lake, coming towards him, and he's managed to gain a respite of a few hours' peace, but nevertheless they're on their way to see him. I mean, there are very, very few people who have that kind of magnetism about them, that kind of superstar status. You do find that, of course, these days, with people who are ultra famous, people in our own society who, wherever they go, they can't go out in public without being known or followed, or a crowd would come and see them. But for people in that day, that was incredibly unusual. And here you have thousands, 5,000 people following Jesus. The pull then towards Jesus was immense and probably unseen at any time by anyone or anywhere other than in this particular case. The whole world has gone after him, complained the Pharisees. Well, they don't go after us, but they go after Jesus. And when Jesus looked up and saw a great crowd coming towards him, he said to Philip, "Where shall we buy bread for these people to eat?" Strange thing to say on a number of fronts. Why would he be concerned about them eating at that time? Well, because presumably, first of all, he knew that it had taken many, many, many hours for them to travel from where they were around the Sea of Galilee to where he was. And during that time, they had no time to rest, no coffee shops on the way. They would be tired, and they would be hungry, and they would be looking for rest and sustenance. So there's a sense of caring about other people and also understanding their needs at this time. It's a perception of putting yourself in the shoes of other people. It could well even be that the disciples themselves at this time and Jesus himself were also hungry. No shops up on the mountainside there. Again, no Starbucks or Nero or Costa to just take a bit of refreshment from. So Jesus first of all says, where shall we buy bread for these people to eat? But he does show concern for them. But that's not the only reason that he asked the question. It shows he asked the question because it says he wanted to test Philip. Now, why he singled out Philip? Hard to say. Some people have suggested that maybe Philip was the most doubting or slow-witted of all the disciples. I think we can't draw that necessary conclusion. That doesn't necessarily follow. Philip did actually come from that local area, and Philip did come from Bethsaida, which is the kind of place where you'd have to go in order to buy food and bread. He would be the person, therefore, to ask if it was purely on a practical basis. But the reason he asked him was not because he wanted a genuine answer from the point of view of, well, there's 3 shops that I can point you to. Nothing like that. It says he wanted to test Philip. Now, that's interesting. Testing him means putting his spiritual faith to the test. What kind of a response would Philip give? Would it be purely practical, on a practical level, or would he see beyond that and grasp something of the nature of who we're living with and dealing with here in the nature of Christ? What does he make of me in terms of what I can do? I think that's the kind of test that's being done. Do you really understand who I am? He said that to the woman. If you knew who it was who asks you, you'd have asked him and he would have given you living water. Well, if you knew who it was who was with you, Philip, you'd have asked him and he would have given you all the bread you needed to eat. It's that kind of a sense of importance of testing that we're talking about. Philip did not rise to that test any more than the woman at the well rose to the test either, or even Nicodemus rose to the test. People always seem to fall short of the understanding of who the nature is. It's a slow dawning realization. But the important point here, I think, is that Jesus' nature of knowledge of who he is and his self-understanding of the abilities, powers, and very presence of the person, of who he is something which he is conscious of. And he's conscious that the gulf between what he knows about himself and what the disciples understand him to be is massive still. And he's trying to bridge that gap over a period of time, till in the end they have the same understanding of who he is that he has of himself. But there is that gap here. So when Jesus looked up and saw them, he said to Philip, where shall we buy some bread for these people to eat? And he asked this only to test him, and the kind of test I've just mentioned, for he already had in mind what he was going to do. If he already had in mind what he was going to do, he was not interested in a reply which said, well, there were 3 bread shops round the corner, down the street, and if you turn left, you'll find them there. Not interested in that kind of an answer. He knew what he was already going to do. He was going to feed them himself. That's what he already knew. He already knew he had the power to do that he could feed them himself. In the same way in which Moses fed the people in the wilderness with manna from heaven, so Jesus had the power in the same way that Moses does, in order to feed the people with bread too. It shows that he's on the same basis as Moses and sees himself in the same tradition as someone who is fulfilling all those kind of prophecies that Moses wrote about. We'll see more of that in a moment or two. Does Philip meet the test? Sadly, no. Not at this point, at any rate. Philip answered him, 8 months' wages would not buy enough bread for each one to have a bite. Literally 200 denarii would not have enough bread for each one to have a bite. By a bite, he means just a morsel to bite, because there were so many, 5,000 people. What would that take these days? 5,000 McDonald's, 5,000 loaves or sandwiches, from which it would take a huge amount of money to do that. Think of it today. A sandwich these days, what would that cost? £2. So if you had 5,000 of them, you need £10,000 worth of food. That's the kind of level of thing. Where are we going to get that kind of food? Impossible. Even if we had, £1,000 worth, it wouldn't give them much more than a bite to eat. Yeah. I know that, says Jesus, because I've already planned something different. And I wanted to know from you, Philip, if you also understood who I am sufficiently to be able to realise that I can provide the answer for that in the same way that it's provided by God himself. Another of his disciples, that's Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, spoke up. Here's a boy with 5 small barley loaves and 2 small fish. But how far will that go among so many? We're not sure about who the boy is. We're not sure about where the boy came from. In fact, we don't know anything about him at all, really. He might have been someone who was carrying that back to his family, to his mother, and just happened to stop by to see what the crowd was like. It could be that he was a seller of bread and food, and this is what he had left as he went around from place to place. Clearly was more than he was needed for himself anyway. So, a trader, or maybe someone who was going back home to take food back. Either way, he came across the disciples came across him, maybe they were looking for some kind of bread or whatever it may be, and Simon, Peter's brother, Andrew, mentioned him to Jesus. Jesus said, make the people sit down, which was fine, because they'd have arrived by now, and they'd all turned up, and they were swarming around the area. Make them all sit down. They are hungry, they are tired, and if they sit down in groups, and they'd sat down. They sat down, now interestingly enough, it said, the men sat down, about 5,000 of them, and they sat down in groups, it says. They distributed as much as they like. In maybe another place, they sat down in groups of 150. Now, the only point of saying that elsewhere is that at least you can count them. If you can count them, then you'll know that if they sat down in groups of 100 each, and that seems to be some organisation. Not sure why they would organise it like that, unless they knew that they were going to distribute food, because if you want to distribute some food to groups of people, then you can't just hand it out willy-nilly, because then you don't know where it's going to or who's got it. So you sit them down in groups of 100, 10 by 10, in rows. You'd have to do it in order to make sure that everyone is covered. And you've got how many groups of 100? Well, you've got 10 groups of 100 for 1,000, and therefore there must have been 50 groups of 100 for 5,000 people. 50 groups of them. That's a lot of groups of 100 in each one. And then you've got 12 disciples who would be given maybe they'd need 3 groups each, 4 groups each to deal with. Let's take it that way. And they are like the waiters or the people, the go-betweens. And Jesus Christ is taking the bread and the fish, and it says, having made them sat down, and there's plenty of grass to sit down at that point, Jesus took the loaves, gave thanks, and distributed to those who were seated as much as they wanted. And he did the same with the fish. Now, you have to envisage this and see the situation here. You've got only Jesus is handling the bread and the fish. You can see that from the description here. And you've got the 12 people, and maybe there were some others who came to help too, who were given that task of distribution. And Jesus is breaking this bread into chunks. And as he does so, there were more chunks, and he's handing this out to people. They must have been watching this with some amazement, because I can't envisage myself how it seemed to occur. No one seems to think about, if you break a loaf of bread and give some, the loaf of bread is still the same as it was, and then you break another loaf off, and it still comes back, and then another loaf. Whatever happened, we don't really know, but it must have been something of that nature, if this is a real miracle, of course. There are those who challenge that. There are some who have suggested that there is no real miracle taking place here except the miracle of generosity. I have heard that people have said that what you have here is that Jesus stood up in front of a crowd of people and then said, I will distribute whatever I have, the 5 loaves and the 2 fishes. I will give it out to other people, and in the same way set an example to all of you who are sitting down here for you to share what you have with all the people around you, and so everyone will have enough and be fed. I find that highly unlikely. And I find it highly unlikely for a number of reasons. But number one is, it's all very well to go and do that if everyone's brought a picnic with them, or most people have brought a picnic with them. Unlikely that they would do such a thing, because it seems to be a spur-of-the-moment event when they come and follow Jesus. They've got no time to prepare things and take a whole day's worth of food with them, which they already carry around and then can share with others. Seems to me that it's quite unlikely there would be enough food amongst the people anyway, unless you've already planned to give them a packed lunch before they go out of the house that day and take it away with them and then share that what they have. So I think that's unlikely on that ground. But also it's unlikely on the grounds of what follows, because this is recorded as a sign. It's recorded as a miraculous event. Even Jesus later on in this chapter speaks of it of, you're only interested in me because I was able to produce a miraculous amount of food. And also because Jesus refers to Moses feeding people in the desert, and that's what he has done here. And that was a miraculous event too. So for all those reasons, I would say it's extraordinarily unlikely that this is merely an example of sharing kindness and distributing what you have to other people. There wouldn't have been enough to go around anyway, never mind have all those left over. So Jesus took the loaves, gave thanks, and distributed it. Gives it to the 12 disciples. They go and take each row of food there to the rows and hand it out as they go along. This must have taken an hour or 2 hours to distribute this food. It's just Jesus doing the miracle of multiplication here, passing it out as fast as he can to different people, here, there, and everywhere. And yet it must have taken, just practically, it must have taken a long time to meet those groups of people, those 50 groups of 100 people each. To meet that, probably 2 or 3 hours. So this is not some quick and light event that takes place here. And Jesus must have found that time of doing that, breaking the bread for that length of time, exhausting, tiring, physically challenging to do that for so long a time. And yet does it. It says that Jesus took the loaves, gave thanks, and distributed to those who were seated as much as they wanted. Notice that he gave thanks for the food before he distributed it. And this is characteristic of Jesus, that whenever they seem to have eaten, it seems to have been part and parcel of his natural habit to give thanks to the Father for what has been given and for what was about to be received. It's a habit which Christians do these days automatically almost in many cases, which is to say grace before food. And it's echoed here as a practice which Jesus himself undertook. And that's a practice which we can do automatically and fall into the habit of doing. But ultimately what's behind it is the feeling of gratitude. Gratitude to God for the things that we have, and not taking things for granted. That even the food that we have, which sustains us from day to day, is not something that we have any right to, but rather something which is given to us bountifully by God who sustains the world. We could very easily, but for the grace of God, find ourselves in a position where we had no food to eat, and many people have been in that position. And therefore, to have food to eat on a daily basis is something to be grateful for, and something we often forget to be grateful for. Some of the things that we are, having health and strength, the common things of life that we take for granted so much, are things which, if we step back and think about them, they could be so easily lost and so easily given up by others, and we would then be without. So, something to be grateful for. Jesus gave thanks for physical food, and he did the same for the fish, and then he distributed them. When they had all had enough to eat, in other words, there's a constant supply going back to the people until they're eating, until nobody needs any more. Now that's interesting, because what that means is that people are satisfied. There's no people left over with hunger. In fact, they're so satisfied that more food was distributed than was actually necessary. That's an abundance. The idea of the biblical measure of pressed down and overflowing. There's more than is required here. When they had enough to eat, he said to the disciples, "Gather the pieces which are left over, let nothing be wasted." So they gathered them, and they filled 12 baskets with the pieces of the 5 barley loaves left over by those who had eaten. Why would you do that? Why would you gather up the pieces, let nothing be wasted? Why is that? And what does it mean, let nothing be wasted? How is it going to be used? None of those things are necessarily answered. We'd have to read between the lines to be able to understand that. It could simply be that, on the one hand, by gathering up all the pieces that were left over, showing that they filled 12 baskets, it attests to the miraculous here. This is another reason why it couldn't simply be something which was a sharing between the crowd. 12 baskets full is in contrast to the 5 loaves and 2 fish, because that wouldn't fill 12 baskets. So there was some multiplication taking place here, which is beyond rational and physical understanding. And there's more left over than when we actually began with and started. That's never the case normally. Whenever you eat a normal meal, you have more at the beginning than you have at the end, because whatever's left over is a small percentage of what you started with. This subverts that kind of mathematics, because you now have more at the end than you had at the beginning. That may be an indication here why it was done, in order to show forth the miracle in a strong contrast between before and after, because it certainly does that. But there's a reason given, and the reason is, let nothing be wasted. And I think that's another lesson. In the same way as the lesson of generosity and gratitude, the feeling of being thankful for what we have, there is a lesson here of let nothing be wasted, which was that so often we might have a surplus of what we have, and very often that does go wasted. We're told that in our own country here, food is often wasted. Huge amounts of food. I forget how many million tons of food is wasted every day and thrown away. out of restaurants or out of homes where things go past their sell-by date. Jesus has an antipathy against waste. And that may be because there are those who are still in want, wherever we happen to be. But it may also be, I suppose, because waste itself is not a good thing. Waste in and of itself is not a good thing. And that the idea that when you create something, you create it for a purpose. You don't create it for the purpose of waste or to throw away. That something good needs to be done with things which are created and used, so that everything should have its use and everything should be used to the full. That's how it should be. They were gathered together, all the crumbs, 12 baskets, and then the question comes, what happened to the 12 baskets of leftovers? Well, they would be wasted if they were just thrown away, so one can gather that maybe they were not just thrown away. It may be that you gather up such things because, well, you don't want to leave a mess on the hillside where you've just been. Very often if you go to a concert where you've been to Glastonbury or something like that, and you've had 5,000 people in a field, and you see them leave, the mess which is left behind is horrendous, and you need a team of people to go in there and clear up. There's an idea here, therefore, that Jesus and God the Father are gods of order and not a god of mess. And there's a lesson, I suppose, for us, that if we are people who use resources, we should clean up after ourselves and make sure that things are well organised, tidy and not wasted. The idea of not wasting things, I think, is something which we can take away with us from this as a practical lesson to do something about that. And if there is waste in our own lives and things that we do, then maybe we should think rather carefully about how we use the resources that we have, whether we overuse them, whether we buy too many things, whether we are living beyond the needs of ordinary requirements, or whether it's just avaricious and greedy. There's the idea of greed attached to having too much left over as well. That my old grandmother used to say that your mouth is much bigger than your belly. The idea that, or your eyes are much bigger, that you want things that you don't even need. And that's something that we need to be aware of as a lesson that comes out of this. But let's move on. So they gathered them, filled 12 baskets with the pieces of 5 barley loaves left over by those who had eaten. And after the people saw the miraculous sign that Jesus did, they began to say, surely this is the prophet who is to come into the world. And Jesus, knowing that they intended to come and make him king by force, withdrew again into the hills by himself. Again, this indicates that the idea that this was merely a matter of sharing kindness as an example to all others so that they too can share what they have, don't think that that will actually cut it. That doesn't explain the idea of the words miraculous sign, because that wouldn't be a miraculous sign. There wouldn't be any miracle involved with that. And they wouldn't have said, surely, as a consequence of what they saw, surely this is the prophet who is to come into the world. The prophet mentioned in Deuteronomy is the one who was coming and predicted to come as a messenger from God, who would carry the words of God. So, clearly the indication here is that something miraculous, something from God has been seen here today, something beyond question, and something which filled the people with such an enthusiasm for Jesus Christ and an overwhelming sense that this is a person from God who can do things which nobody else can do, made them want him to be in charge and the king of the country. That would, of course, put him at odds with the leadership of the country, and even more than that, would put him at odds with not only Herod, the puppet king of the Romans, but of the Roman Empire itself. This would be the basis for revolution, for the overturning of the Roman Empire and the occupation. And no doubt many people who followed Jesus wanted that to happen, and they wanted him to be promoting the return to self-rule within Jerusalem. Jesus, knowing that they intended to come and make him king by force, interestingly enough, the power of the crowd would impel him to take him by force to Jerusalem. He withdrew again into the hills by himself. Making someone king by force shows a kind of desperation, kind of an enthusiasm out of control, something which wouldn't even listen to the protestations of Jesus, but would force him, or seek to force him, to engage with the authorities and to overthrow them. That's not the game that Jesus was involved in. As he said elsewhere, render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and render to God the things that are God's. And he himself, of course, is the Son of God, and is not interested in rebellious overthrows of dictatorships or occupying forces. And on that point, then, we leave this astonishing event of Jesus Christ, who has shown himself again to be someone who can do only the things which the Son of God can do, and leaving people realizing that this is someone so special that he ought to be their ruler and the one that they would give all their allegiance to.